Welcome back to another episode of Grizzly True Crime. My name is Gisela K, and today we continue to read together line by line and page by page. It's a 102-page document. It is Moab Police's response to the investigative report, which is based on their original incident report relating to Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie from the police stop on August 12th. So let's continue. Today we start again on page 13. If you haven't seen part 1, I would recommend that. It's on the playlist and I'll link it below as well. So today we're going to continue on with part 2. Let's get started. Thank you so much for joining me here today. If you are new here, then I hope that at some point during this video, you'll consider subscribing and becoming part of the Grizzly community. And if you are already a Grizzly, then welcome back. It's always nice to see you. I have my Keep It Grizzly mug here with coffee in it. Love coffee. Thank you to all of you who also buy me a coffee. The link for that is below as well. So today we continue on. It's going to be a bit of a longer one because I want to cover this whole section. So it will be a little while. So I hope you have coffee too, and let's get started. Utah State Code. Okay, here and there I take myself off the screen so that you can just focus on what we're talking about. Okay, Utah State Code. Powers and duties to arrest. Utah State Code 77362.2. The primary duty of law enforcement officers responding to a domestic violence call is to protect the victim and enforce the law. Sustained. So just one more thing before we get started, just to remind you, here is the code that they're using. We're going to go up a little bit. For the findings, as it relates to various policies of law, I will provide the following responses. Unfounded, right? The investigation finds there was no violation. Exonerated, the investigation finds a violation did occur, but that it was justified, lawful, and or proper. Not sustained, investigation finds there is insufficient evidence to sustain or exonerate a violation of the specific code or policy. And sustained, the investigation finds sufficient evidence to establish that the code or policy was violated. Okay, so now you've got that code. Let us have a look then as we go through, just so that you know what all the red means that they're responding with. Okay, powers and duties to arrest, Utah State Code. That's what we just looked at. The primary duty of law enforcement officers responding to a domestic violence call is to protect the victim and enforce the law. Sustained. In addition to the arrest powers described in section 7772, when a peace officer responds to a DV call and has probable cause to believe that an act of DV has been committed, the peace officer shall arrest without a warrant or shall issue a citation to any person that the peace officer has probable cause to believe has committed an act of DV. Sustained. This incident from the beginning was classified as an assault that took place between a male and a female. During the investigation, it was found they were cohabitants. It is my finding that an assault did take place, therefore should be classified as a DV investigation. This incident starts with both witnesses, who included the witness that called 911 and reported Brian slapping Gabby, to a second witness that stated Gabby was hitting Brian and Brian pushed or shoved Gabby. It continued on with the roadside investigation and statements made by both Brian and Gabby. I have already documented the many statements they each made to law enforcement. In short, Brian and Gabby each acknowledged a verbal argument that escalated into a physical confrontation. Brian and Gabby each acknowledged getting physical with each other. It was also concluded Brian and Gabby were cohabitants due to their statements that they were engaged and living together. There were 4 statements made, with these 3 of the statements being fairly consistent stories, Gabby, Brian, and one of the 2 witnesses. A combination of using all of these individual statements, along with the observations and physical evidence, would point towards Gabby being the predominant aggressor, at least as it relates to this specific incident. As it relates to the 4th witness, contact was not made with him outside the 911 call, so there's no written statement and no formal interview conducted. In his statement to dispatch, he stated he saw the gentleman slapping the girl. He stated he was driving when he first observed Brian and Gabby, and stated he pulled over and continued observation of the couple, then said the male and female ran up and down the sidewalk where he proceeded to hit her. When speaking with Gabby, Officer Pratt shared this person's statement to Gabby as it related to Brian hitting Gabby. Gabby replied, "To be honest, I definitely hit him first." When pressed for details and after Gabby said Brian just grabbed her to prevent her from hitting him, Officer Pratt asked, "Did he hit you though?" Officer Pratt stresses the importance of telling the truth. Gabby replied, "I guess, but I hit him first." Officer Pratt asked where Brian hit her. Gabby stated Brian grabbed my face, I guess, while also demonstrating the action. Gabby states, "Like he didn't punch me in the face." Gabby said Brian grabbed her face and said she could feel a cut on her left cheek. Gabby stated when she touches her cheek, it burns. The end result of this investigated incident concluded with separating Brian and Gabby and not making an arrest, either by citation or custody. Based on the information provided, in this specific incident, Brian would be the victim, with Gabby being the suspect. Oh my goodness. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think should have happened? Should they both have been arrested? Gabby, yes, should have been cited. I think if they were saying that they should treat them both equally, then they should have, and also taken pictures of Gabby's injuries on her face, taken pictures of her hands, and just how they treated Brian. And yeah, I don't know. Let me know what you think. I would love to hear your thoughts. As it relates to the primary duty of law enforcement while responding to a DV call, the officers protected the victim by separating Brian from Gabby. However, I do not find that they enforced the law. They responded to a confirmed DV incident, and they had evidence showing an assault had taken place. The statements of all those involved, along with the evidence presented, provided probable cause for an arrest. Oh man, if you're going to follow protocol, then follow it all the way through, right? Officer Pratt talks in detail multiple times about the lack of discretion law enforcement officers have when it comes to a DV incident. It is clear to me that an arrest, either by citation or custody, was decided would be the most appropriate action to take throughout this entire investigation. Yes, Officer Pratt describes to Gabby the actions they must take, and Gabby becomes extremely emotional, talking about how she doesn't want to be separated from Brian. Let me know what you think about that. Don't you think that she didn't want to be separated from him? Maybe she had separation anxiety, but I just feel like that fear of the consequence the next day when she met up with him, that's what I think she was worried about, but I mean, that's just my personal opinion. Let me know what your opinion is as well. And remember to keep it Grizzly. Nothing too graphic, okay? Officer Pratt describes to Gabby the actions they must take, and Gabby becomes, yes, extremely emotional, talking about how she doesn't want to be separated from Brian. Officer Pratt states they lawfully don't have discretion here. Officer Pratt tells Gabby that the best thing he can do for her at this point is to speak to a supervisor to see if he's missing something. Officer Pratt explained to Gabby he didn't think there was anything he was missing, but would still follow up with the supervisor and ask. Officer Pratt calls Assistant Chief Palmer and explains the circumstances. Officer Pratt tells Assistant Chief Palmer at the end of the conversation that he's going to reread the statute and see if this fits, or if there's a way that it doesn't fit. When speaking to Officer Robbins regarding his conversation with Assistant Chief Palmer, Officer Pratt indicates the only way they can't take action on this case is if the circumstances don't fit what the statute states. Officer Pratt stated if it fits, then they must follow the law and they must take action. In a subsequent interview with Officer Pratt and Assistant Chief Palmer, they both recalled this conversation and the answers to what the context of what the content of this conversation was, and was consistent. Assistant Chief Palmer stated he referred Officer Pratt to city policy and state law and to follow what fits the situation. Assistant Chief Palmer stated he was not on scene and didn't have all the facts that Officer Pratt had, so that was the gist of his advice. Officer Pratt confirmed this by stating he was told to do what fits. If it's a domestic, do a domestic. If it's not, then don't. Officer Pratt starts looking at the specific wording used in Utah Criminal Code for assault, 765102, and the definition of bodily injury, 76.16014. This is where I believe Officer Pratt made a mistake by assigning the wrong culpability to the code, intentional, as well as not reading the entirety of the assault statute. Oh man, he was there, like reading up on it, like so close, but yet so far, right? So they are admitting that mistakes were made. I know some people have really not gone through this whole document line by line like this. So I know some of you like this and some of you don't. Some of you just want a summary. I know plenty of channels do summaries. I'm going to go through every single page because that's just how I roll. Believe me, I've tried to just tell myself, just make a summary. I can't. I have to go through everything with you. I've read this, but I got to go through everything with you. That's just how we roll here. Okay, so when they say, he was reading the statute but didn't read it in its entirety and also made a mistake by assigning the wrong culpability. Oh, man. According to Utah Criminal Code for assault, it states, assault is an attempt with unlawful force or violence to do bodily injury to another, or an act committed with unlawful force or violence that causes bodily harm or bodily injury to another, or creates a substantial risk of bodily injury to another. Officer Pratt tells Officer Robbins how important it is to read the actual verbiage of what is written in the various codes. Officer Pratt talks about the verbiage of assault being the intent to do bodily injury. Officer Pratt only reads subsection A of the statute. Officer Pratt then looks up the definition of bodily injury in Utah Criminal Code and reads it to Officer Robbins. The definition in Utah Criminal Code for bodily injury states, bodily injury means physical pain, illness, or any impairment of physical condition. As it is written, intent is not written in the assault code, and as I previously said, I believe Officer Pratt made a mistake in the way he interpreted the code, as well as not reading the complete code. As it relates to various crimes written throughout the Utah State Criminal Code, there are many crimes that specifies the culpability, intent, needed to fit a specific statute or classification. These are explained in Utah Criminal Code 76-103. There are 4 culpability definitions explained, which are intentionally, knowingly, recklessly, and with criminal negligence. In Utah Criminal Code 76-102, it describes the culpable mental state requirements. It states, every offense not involving strict liability shall require a culpable mental state. And when the definition of the offense does not specify a culpable mental state, and the offense does not involve strict liability, intent, knowledge, or recklessness, shall suffice to establish criminal responsibility. An offense shall involve strict liability if the statute defining the offense clearly indicates a legislative purpose to impose criminal responsibility for commission of the conduct prohibited by the statute without requiring proof of any culpable mental state. Since the assault statute doesn't provide a culpability requirement, and it also does not label it as a strict liability offense, intent, knowledge, or recklessness is what would be required to establish criminal responsibility for the assault. Officer Robbins asked Officer Pratt if the definition included attempt and intent, or attempt or intent. Officer Pratt replies stating, when you're attempting to do something, you have to intend to do it. By Officer Pratt believing assault had the highest level of culpability intentionally, he believed that Gabby had to have acted with the intent to cause the injuries that Brian sustained, and therefore didn't believe this incident fit the statute after asking Gabby what her intent was. However, as previously explained, assault does not have an assigned culpability written in the statute, so the culpability of assault would have to meet the requirements of intent, knowledge, or recklessness. At one point during this incident, Officer Pratt tells Officer Robbins that he doesn't care if they use the actual letter of the law in deciding not to charge Gabby. He also tells Officer Robbins that it makes sense to go full-on domestic assault. When people talk about the letter of the law, they are talking about the actual words written, the literal interpretation of the words. This line of thinking lines up with what Officer Pratt explains later on, that one officer may see things differently than another officer, and Officer Pratt believed this incident didn't meet the elements of the assault code as it was written. Whoa, so much legal stuff. I don't know what to comment at this point. I just want to I just want to work through this with you. You comment. Let me know what you think. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Applicable interview responses, Officer Pratt. In a subsequent interview with Officer Pratt, I asked how he reached the conclusion that this incident was more accurately categorized as a mental or emotional health break than a domestic assault. Officer Pratt said he applied his numerous years in law enforcement as well as his overall life experience when stating he believed to see signs of mental health issues from both Brian and Gabby. Officer Pratt said, I saw the dynamics of their relationship. If there were all these red flags that he was going to murder Gabby, I didn't see those. I saw the same red flags I see every time I get called to a relationship issue. They don't call us there because they're doing great and want the police to come over and see how great they're doing. They call us because something is devolved. Officer Pratt described seeing this as another unhealthy relationship. Officer Pratt said, if it was not an assault, which I decided it wasn't, then what else could it? Then what could I call it? It wasn't an assault. If it was an assault, she would have had to be arrested. But there's elements to the offense of assault, and you have to meet those. Oh man, my only thought is like, so the scratch on her face? Oh no, the scratches on his? That's not assault? I would hate to think, what is then? You know what I mean? I don't know. And yeah, of course, it's such tricky ground, but for a police officer to be like, yeah, mental health crisis. I don't know. I don't think they should go that way. This is why so many people were like, you have to have a mental health professional there, which would probably not fit the budget, right? My goodness. I asked Officer Pratt if he believed a DV assault took place during this incident. Officer Pratt gave the example that one officer will handle a call different than another officer based on their training experience and their interpretation of the totality of the circumstances presented to them. Officer Pratt said, it's our duty to document and to support with reasoning, logic, and hopefully the law backing us, because we all read the same code, why we choose to do the arrest or not do the arrest. And the better you are at that, usually the better cop you are. But everyone makes mistakes or reads something wrong. Officer Pratt stated he had determined that one of the elements for assault was missing. Officer Pratt explained this as being the attempt to use unlawful force or violence to cause bodily injury to Brian. Oh my word. That's also such tricky ground, because I think if you had to ask a victim of DV or an aggressor, did you intend to cause bodily harm? I don't imagine the aggressor would be like, yup. They're all going to say, nope, just happened. It's almost like, I don't know. This is very, very tricky ground to navigate. Interesting. Wow. I mean, it seemed very much like DV, especially with people calling into 911. It's not like police officers drove by and then they're like, oh my word, there's a couple fighting a little bit. Okay, it's just a little spat. It's not DV. I think it would fall under DV because at least two witnesses called 911. I mean, it was that serious. There were people seeing it. I mean, allegedly, according to Jason Jensen, the PI, right, private investigator in Kylan Schulte and Crystal Turner Beck's case, they were also there. They also observed this. It was quite a scene. So I think even in my mind, the fact that there were these 911 calls, which is like there's witnesses observing this and thinking it's serious enough to call 911, to me, that is like equals DV. Not? Let me know what you think. Okay, so Officer Pratt explained this as being the attempt to use unlawful force or violence to cause bodily injury to Brian. Well, why didn't they ask Brian the same question? Officer Pratt described this, stating, implicit with attempt is intent. You can't attempt something with no intent to do it. So obviously intent is part of the assault. Officer Pratt stated this was the reason why he asked Gabby what her intent was when she was hitting Brian. Officer Pratt stated, most guys our size would say that you can't slap people and do that, but followed up with, well, we've never been a 110-pound female. Oh man, here's a shovel, dude. You're digging yourself a deeper hole here. That's what I'm gathering. Officer Pratt stated Gabby's intent was important, and when she was asked why she was slapping Brian, Gabby said, "I just wanted him to stop telling me to calm down." Officer Pratt said that sounded very reasonable to him, and that he didn't think that she had the intent behind it to do bodily injury to him. "I think she wanted to modify his behavior, and she doesn't have the tools in her toolbox to do it." Whew. Again, here's a shovel because you're digging yourself a deeper hole with this response. I'm just like, oh no. It's very bad. Because to say, well, I've never been a 110-pound female, eek, and then to say, it's very reasonable. If you just want him to calm down, sure, slap him a little bit because you're just trying to modify his behavior. That's like, it just doesn't sound right. No, that is not how you, in any case, no matter who does it, you can't really justify slapping where they both have injuries to their face by saying, well, I think she was just trying to modify his behavior. She wasn't intending to do bodily harm, because isn't that the crux of freaking DV cases? I mean, a DV aggressor would say, yep, I was just trying to modify their behavior. If a DV aggressor sees this, they'll be like, oh, so I can go there. I didn't have intent to harm them. I was just trying to modify their behavior. That's the problem. Oh my word. Officer Pratt added, that's why we spend so much time in court, way more time than I have on the side of the road. They have entire days of trial spent nothing more than just establishing intent on a crime. I don't have special expert witnesses on the side of the road. I don't have 5 days of my trial with these people to figure out who to charge. I got like less than an hour apparently, so they trust me after 16 years to figure it out, and I took my 16 years of experience and said I believed Gabby based on the totality of the circumstances and based on what she appears physically capable of and based on what I saw him doing and act the way he was acting, that I don't think she assaulted him. Oh no, we can't look at how he's acting because he's a freaking chameleon, right? He was a very, very good boy that day, but then he was very angry again at the restaurant just 2 weeks later. Officer Pratt also added what he believed could happen if Gabby had been arrested and Brian bailed her out and signed the protective order waiver. Officer Pratt pointed out that Brian had said they didn't have a lot of money. Well, apparently he's got $20,000 in his account now, isn't it? Officer Pratt said, so if he's going to go bail her out, is he not going to have more control over her now? Now we're out of money. Blame it on her because I had to bail you out. Remember, step 1, scan the plates of the van and know that it's Gabby's van. And I don't know if they can check bank account balances or what, but the van was Gabby's van, so he is so not in control because it was her van. And he stole her money after her death even. So I don't know, I just feel like, I understand what he's saying here, but I'm like, oh man, if they could have just searched the car, maybe found a gun. Or if they could have just scanned the plates and know, oh my word, this van belongs to this girl, as they're saying, this 110-pound, oh my word, little lady. Yeah, the van is hers. Exactly. Oh my word. I don't know if this makes you anxious reading all this stuff. It makes me freaking anxious. I'm just like, what? Okay, so that's why we're going through it together, okay? Hang in there. Oh my word. Okay, so he said, blame it on her because I had to bail you out. You know, all it's going to do is put the power and dynamics more on him in his favor, where he's like, now we have to come back to court or video court. Now we don't have the money because I had to bail you out. Oh, we're in another fight. Go ahead and call the cops. How did that go for you last time? Oh dear. I asked Officer Pratt where he looked up the code for assault, and he stated it was from the Utah legislature website. I asked Officer Pratt if at the time of this incident, if he believed he read the entire definition of assault to Officer Robbins. Officer Pratt states he believes he did, and also stated he looked up the definition of bodily injury to further expand on what the code was stating. Officer Pratt stated he first had to see if the crime of assault was met, and if so, then they would be able to attach the DV attribute to that. However, if there was no crime of assault, then it couldn't be a DV assault. I asked Officer Pratt if he still believes to this day, November the 1st, 2021, that attempt and intent were synonymous or implicit with each other. Officer Pratt stated, to this day, I still believe that. Oh boy. Officer Pratt stated if he's wrong, he would adjust his future interactions in acknowledgement of that information. I explained to Officer Pratt the 4 culpabilities and their levels. I also read Officer Pratt the assault code in full. Officer Pratt said, that does change things. Oh no. Officer Pratt stated he is sure he has read that part of the assault code before, and it has to be addressed. Officer Pratt said he probably got sidetracked with the bodily injury portion of the assault code and went and read the definition for bodily injury, neglecting to scroll down and read the rest of the assault statute. Officer Pratt said, and if I did, that's a mistake, and it may have changed our decisions, but I can't say that even here now until I read it and really think about it for a few minutes, because I do take the act of putting people in handcuffs and taking their freedom and giving them charges very seriously, and I usually spend a little bit of time reading up on it first and then trying to figure out if that's going to fly. So yes, that second part you said, I would admit that could have changed what we decided to do, but I would still have to look it over and think about it. Oh my gosh. Okay. Shall we have a sip of coffee before we continue? Oh my word. Okay, here we go. Applicable interview responses, Officer Robbins. In a subsequent interview with Officer Robbins, I asked how he reached the conclusion that an assault did not take place. I'd like to know. Officer Robbins stated he observed the code Officer Pratt showed him, and in that code it said with the intent to cause harm. Officer Robbins stated, I went with that one because she said that she didn't have the intent to harm him. I asked Officer Robbins if he just went with what he was told by Officer Pratt or if he actually observed the code himself. Officer Robbins stated Officer Pratt showed me the code. Officer Robbins added again that the assault code says, with the intent to cause bodily injury. I read the assault code in full and asked Officer Robbins if anywhere in the code it said the word intent. Officer Robbins said it might have been somewhere else, I'm not sure. You know, this focus on this word intent, it just makes me sad. Because, okay, sorry also that my eye is like sparkling. Because if someone commits SA, and you know what that is, right? And you ask that someone, were you intending to, I don't know what. I can't even word it. I can't phrase this correctly because it's just so, But if you ask anyone abusing someone else, were you intending to do that? They're never going to be like, yep. So that is, to focus on this intent thing is just, oh man. That would not get many people in cuffs, you know, because they would say, nope, I did not intend that, no matter who they asked. I asked Officer Robbins if he actually felt at the time of this incident that the definition of assault included the intent to cause bodily injury. Officer Robbins said yes. I asked Officer Robbins if his decision during this incident was a decision made to benefit himself or anyone else. Officer Robbins stated he did what he thought was best for the situation. I asked Officer Robbins if he was aware of the duties of arrest in Utah State Code. Officer Robbins stated he was aware. I read him the duties of arrest and asked Officer Robbins if he believed he followed Utah State Code. Officer Robbins said, at the time I did. I asked Officer Robbins how he reached the conclusion written in his report that states, I do not believe the situation escalated to the level of a domestic assault as much as that of a mental health crisis, and I asked how he quantified the two. Officer Robbins stated he was trying to fix the problem and figure out what the underlying problem was. Yeah, I don't think that is the job of a police officer. Anyway, officer, that sounds like psychology to me. Officer Robbins didn't feel it was an ongoing issue of assault, but an ongoing mental health issue. Not that they checked Gabby's body for any injuries, huh? They made Brian lift his top, but I'm not saying Gabby must lift her top. It's just like they didn't check her body for, we don't know if she had lots of bruises and things. I know people have enhanced some of her photos and seen bruises and stuff, even around her neck and on her arms, and I don't know. It's just, I wish she was checked equally. Even by the park ranger, if you're thinking, no, man, that would be ridiculous. But if you're checking Brian, then check Gabby. If this is what you're trying to figure out, is if this is an ongoing issue. They say it's ongoing issue of assault, but an ongoing mental health issue. Okay, which caused the domestic. I asked if this incident was more of a mental health crisis Why he didn't get Brian and Gabby in touch with mental health professionals? Good question. Officer Robbins stated it was a busy day. Oh no. Shovel anyone? And calls were stacking up left and right, and mistakes were made. It completely slipped my mind. I didn't even think about it. Oh boy. So you want to find the underlying cause, huh? You want to find the underlying cause to this problem of these two hitting each other. Like, why? Let's find the underlying cause. Okay, it's a mental health crisis. But do you then recommend a mental health professional? No. It's just... Oh no. Okay. Officer Robbins stated the stress of the situation and everything else going on at the time contributed to not thinking about doing this. 2B1. If the peace officer has probable cause to believe that there will be continued violence against the alleged victim, or if there is evidence that the perpetrator has either recently caused serious bodily injury or used a dangerous weapon in the domestic violence offense, the officer shall arrest and take the alleged perpetrator into custody and may not utilize the option of issuing a citation under this section. Here they say unfounded. We're going to read some more of it now. But if they checked the car, I would put money on it they would have found a gun. What do you think? I think they would have found a weapon, and then they'd have to find whose weapon is it. Then they'd find out, wait, this is Gabby's van, Brian's gun. Okay, we need to reassess this. We need to look at this. What is going on here? I don't know. I just think that could have made a difference. Based on all the information provided, I did not find that this section applies in this case. There was no information provided that would cause any of the officers to believe there would be continued violence. There was also no information provided that there was serious bodily injury or that a dangerous weapon was used in the domestic violence offense. Did you check for a dangerous weapon? No. Did you look at Gabby's body for injuries? No. Okay then. 2C. If a peace officer does not immediately exercise arrest powers or initiate criminal proceedings by citation or otherwise, the officer shall notify the victim of the right to initiate a criminal proceeding and of the importance of preserving evidence in accordance with requirements of section 7736 2.1. Here they say, sustained. Due to Officer Robbins not exercising arrest powers by custodial or citation arrest. This section would apply to this case. Brian was adamant he did not want to pursue charges against Gabby in this case, and made it clear through his statements that he wouldn't want to initiate criminal proceedings in the future. Brian said, I'm not going to pursue anything, further stating, I want a checklist of things to do to get rid of it. There are numerous things the officers did do as it applied to this section. The officers took action that provided safety for Brian by separating him from Gabby. The officers provided emergency shelter to Brian. Emergency shelter in a motel. And they asked if he needed medical treatment. Did they ask Gabby if she needed medical treatment? No, they recommended a hot shower. Oh. In response, Brian said, no, I'm okay, and referred to his injuries as baby injuries. Oh, already that is just like, that is a problem. Because that means you would refer to Gabby's injuries. That scratch on her face, and who knows if she had bruises on her body or not, or how long she may have been abused by him, as baby injuries. You see, right there. And look what ended up happening to her. I'm not blaming the officers. I'm just saying, Brian saying, no, this is just baby injuries. Well, yeah, look where his behavior can escalate to. Allegedly, because he's the alleged killer, right? What I have found that the officers did not do was meet the requirements in accordance with UCA 7736 2.1. This requires Brian be provided with the immediate and adequate notice of the rights of victims and of the remedies and services available to victims of DV. This should be a written notice that provides information on how to obtain a protective order, a list of shelters, services, and resources, along with phone numbers to assist the victim in accessing any needed assistance. Yes, so if they're going to go all the way to tell Gabby, you go off in your van, we're taking this guy over here to a motel for the night. You can have a shower, kick back, watch some TV. Okay. This is a very inappropriate question from me now, but I wonder if he ever did get his water. Because remember, they were so adamant to go and get water, and he doesn't drink from plastic bottles. So did he drink from you guys call it faucet, from the tap that night, or what did he do? How thirsty was he? Oh my word. It's just like, yeah, if you're going to go all the way to take him to a motel, but then not finish the process of thinking, if you say this is a mental health crisis, okay, where is the list of mental health professionals they can contact? Where's the help? If you say, oh no, this is like, what now, a semi-DV case, so we're going to take him to a motel, okay, but why not provide him then with all of this that they're supposed to? Oh man. If a law enforcement officer receives complaints of domestic violence from two or more opposing persons, the officer shall evaluate each complaint separately to identify the predominant physical aggressor. If the officer determines that one person was the predominant physical aggressor, the officer need not arrest the other person alleged to have committed DV. In determining who the predominant aggressor was, the officer shall consider any prior complaints of DV, the relative severity of injuries inflicted on each person, the likelihood of future injury to each of the parties, and whether one of the parties acted in self-defense. Here, they said it's unfounded. There are some important things to note as it pertains to this section, because throughout this contact, as well as highlighted in the initial complaint, the words primary aggressor is what is commonly used. Primary aggressor and predominant aggressor are not the same thing. A predominant aggressor is not automatically the person who starts a DV incident, and they are also not automatically the person who has the least severe or least amount of injury. In this instance, there were two opposing persons, none of which reported the incident, but was reported by a third party. There were no prior complaints of DV reported by either party, nor was this question asked by either of the officers. The overall severity of the injuries sustained by both parties were minor, as evidenced by the statements made by both parties and the observations of the officers. There was no information provided at the time that would lead the officers to believe there would be continued violence that would lead to the likelihood of future injury. Oh man, unfortunately there was major future injury. Additionally, the statements made specifically by the two involved individuals and one of the two witnesses would lead the officers to believe that Brian was acting in self-defense. An issue with this section is that there was no further investigation into the complaint made by Gabby about Brian grabbing her face and causing the scratch on her cheek, outside what Gabby disclosed. Yes, Brian was not asked about it, and the witness who called 911 was not interviewed. With that said, Gabby made multiple statements to officers that would lead them to believe she was the predominant physical aggressor. There are a couple things that could point to Brian being the predominant physical aggressor. That is, if Gabby hadn't made the statement she did. The lack of emotion and fear from Brian may point towards someone who is the predominant aggressor, but as previously mentioned, Gabby's statements to law enforcement makes it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to substantiate a charge against Brian as it relates to this incident. A law enforcement officer may not threaten, suggest, or otherwise indicate the possible arrest of all parties in order to discourage any party's request for intervention by law enforcement. Unfounded. This is not applicable as no officers made such statements, and Officer Pratt accurately explained to Officer Robbins on scene that this is something they could not do, and explained this is something that is unlawful. Okay. Let us have a quick coffee break, shall we? Just a quick one. If you like my content and would like to say thank you, the easiest way to do that is, of course, to buy a copy of any one of my books, or to buy me a coffee on buymeacoffee.com/Gisela K, which I'll link below for you. Thank you so much for listening. Okay, and we're back. So let's continue. It takes long to work through these documents, huh? It's 102 pages. Let's go. All right, so 5A, a law enforcement officer who does not make an arrest after investigating a complaint of DV or who arrests two or more parties shall submit a detailed written report specifying the grounds for not arresting any party or for arresting both parties. Sustained. And 5B says a law enforcement officer who does not make an arrest shall notify the victim of the right to initiate a criminal proceeding and of the importance of preserving evidence. Unfounded. Now let's see what they say. These sections apply as no arrest was made. However, when speaking with Brian, he made it clear he did not want to be a victim in this case and didn't want any charges brought onto Gabby. It was explained to Brian the lack of discretion officers have in domestic violence cases, and Brian maintained his position that he and Gabby are a team and he didn't want her to be charged. Officer Pratt explained to Brian his options when it came to Brian speaking with a county attorney and Brian's potential future involvement in this case. Brian's injuries were photographed at the time, and there would be no further evidential items that Brian would need to preserve, even though those photographs are no longer available. What? Either by officer error or software error. Oh my gosh. Officer Robbins did take pictures of Brian's injuries for the purpose of preserving and documenting the information. So not only did they not take pictures of Gabby, but they also lost the pictures of Brian. What? There was a report submitted that specified the grounds for not making an arrest. As far as it being detailed, I have documented my many concerns with the content of the case reports under the section further into the report titled Investigation 311.4, subsection B. The lack of details in the report is the justification for sustaining this section above 5A. Okay, we're on page 20. 6A. A law enforcement officer responding to a complaint of DV shall prepare an incident report that includes the officer's disposition of the case. Unfounded. They say this is addressed in the above response. In 6D, the incident report shall be made available to the victim upon request at no cost. Unfounded. To the knowledge of Assistant Chief Palmer, the victim did not attempt to obtain the report following the incident. That I can agree with. He probably would be like, I think Brian saying he wanted to just get rid of, what's the to-do list just to get rid of this? I'm pretty sure he didn't want a copy of it. No. He just wants them to just like Control-Alt-Delete. Just please, just get rid of this. 6E. The law enforcement agency shall forward a copy of the incident report to the appropriate prosecuting attorney within 5 days after the complaint of DV occurred. Sustained. According to Assistant Chief Palmer, he does not believe the report was ever forwarded to the appropriate prosecuting attorney as there were no charges or arrest. Due to this incident being a DV incident, the report should have been filed. Yes, it really should have been filed. The investigating officer made a mistake in miscategorizing the incident, which should have been addressed by administrative personnel as the report was forwarded on from the officer. I don't know, one of the lessons I think could be learned from this is to trust your instincts, because it seemed like the officer was very much going for this DV, and let's just say if we need to arrest Gabby or whatever, then do that. Like he did almost everything and then just didn't follow through. I don't know why that is, but if he believed that this is what must happen, this is the court date, this is what's going to be filed, then man, to even just finish that, it's that last step that could have made all the difference, whether it was providing Brian with shelter information and DV help and all that kind of stuff, or providing both of them with mental health assistance, whatever resources they have that they can offer them. That would have been so great, right? Number 8, each law enforcement agency shall, as soon as practicable, make a written record and maintain records of all incidents of DV reported to it, and shall be identified by a law enforcement agency code for DV. Sustained. There was a case report completed regarding this case, and it has been identified as Moab Police Case 2021-001108. In the case report, the incident is categorized as a disorderly conduct incident and details the disposition of the case. The classification for this report should have been a domestic violence-related category. I wonder why that's the case number. Does it have anything to do? Because 2021, date, and is that the 11th of August? Because this happened on the 12th. So that's interesting. Maybe it's got nothing to do with it. Moab City Domestic Violence Policy. I will detail Moab City's domestic violence policy section by section below. I will not provide a response to the generalities of the policy, but when it talks about specifics of the policy, I will provide a response as it relates to the specific case and investigation. Purpose and scope. The purpose of this policy is to provide the guidelines necessary to deter, prevent, and reduce domestic violence through vigorous enforcement and to address domestic violence as a serious crime against society. The policy specifically addresses the commitment of this department to take enforcement action when appropriate, to provide assistance to victims, and to guide officers in the investigation of DV. Sustained. This section has been addressed previously in the report under Utah State Code. Okay, definitions. Domestic violence includes any crime involving the actual, threatened, or attempted violence or physical harm of a cohabitant. Domestic violence also includes committing or attempting to commit any crime listed in the Utah Code 773614 by one cohabitant against another. See, their attempting and intent is not listed the same way, even attempting to, you see? Policy. The 311.2 policy. The Moab City Police Department's response to incidents of domestic violence and violations of related court orders shall stress enforcement of the law to protect the victim and shall communicate the philosophy that DV is criminal behavior. It is also the policy of this department to facilitate victims and offenders access to appropriate civil remedies and community resources whenever feasible. Sustained. This section has already been addressed previously in the report under Utah State Code. 311.3 Officer Safety. The investigation of DV cases often places officers in emotionally charged and sometimes highly dangerous environments. No provision of this policy is intended to supersede the responsibility of all officers to exercise due caution and reasonable care in providing for the safety of any officers and parties involved. Unfounded. The officers conducted a roadside interview that lasted just over an hour regarding this incident. Despite the emotionally charged environment, the officers spent a significant amount of time investigating the incident and did so with professionalism, empathy, and respect. The officers took due caution in providing for the safety of themselves as well as Brian and Gabby. Investigations. Leave your comments below. The following guidelines should be followed by officers when investigating DV cases. A. Calls. Let me put myself on for a second. I'm still right here. Calls of reported, threatened, imminent, or ongoing domestic violence and the violation of any court order are of extreme importance and should be considered amongst the highest response priorities. This includes incomplete 911 calls. They say unfounded. It is clear from the time this incident was reported, dispatched, and investigated that the incident was handled as a high priority call, which is evidenced by the quick response of law enforcement by multiple agencies to locate and investigate this incident. The call was received at 16:39 hours, and law enforcement had located the involved vehicle and parties by 16:44 hours. I mean, true, that was pretty fast. The last officer on scene, Officer Robbins, cleared the call around 18:04 hours. When practicable, officers should obtain and document statements from the victim, the suspect, and any witnesses, including children in or around the household or location of occurrence. Here they say sustained. There are 2 known witnesses, in addition to those involved in the altercation, Gabby and Brian. Officers were able to obtain verbal statements from Brian and Gabby. Officers were also able to obtain a verbal and written statement from who was on scene where the originating incident took place. Officers had a brief verbal statement via the 911 call from another witness who was not followed up with by law enforcement. The officers didn't have access to the 911 call, but they did have immediate access to the dispatch notes while the call was active. It was surprising to me that wasn't contacted, as Officer Pratt requested their information from dispatch, and dispatch provided the phone number of that person to Officer Pratt over the radio. This information would have also been heard, or should have been heard, by Officer Robbins. In a subsequent interview with Officer Pratt, he described what was happening when he requested that phone number. Officer Pratt stated he had responded to the Moonflower to meet with, and was there relatively quickly following the reported incident. According to the dispatch log, I believe Officer Pratt arrived at the Moonflower between 16:41 and 16:43. Officer Pratt stated he pulled up and started walking around, expecting witnesses to come to him with information. Officer Pratt said it was weird, as everyone around was acting like nothing happened. Wow, everyone was acting like nothing had happened, and nobody expected to see law enforcement show up. Officer Pratt was starting to think maybe the incident occurred elsewhere because nobody was saying anything. That's weird. Officer Pratt said he was walking back to his car when he requested that phone number because he couldn't find that person at the scene. Seconds later, that person walked up and asked if Officer Pratt was there because of the domestic. At that time, Officer Pratt collected details from them about the white van that could help differentiate it from other white vans in the area. Officer Pratt also collected the information to follow up with later, as Officer Robbins had located the wanted vehicle and Officer Pratt needed to respond to that location. After observing all the reports, dispatch log, and body-worn camera in this case, it was practicable for the officers to follow up with the reporting party who called 911. With that said, Officer Pratt's interview with Gabby highlighted a statement made by Brian assaulting Gabby, and Gabby's response to that was, "I definitely hit him first." Officer Pratt called the second witness after Gabby made the statement, and that witness's account was similar to Brian and Gabby's statements. It would be purely speculative to try and explain what could have or might have changed, if anything, by officers reaching out and speaking to the original reporting party. I think it would have been quite valuable. It's important in any investigation to interview and have statements by all those who are involved to better form a conclusion and to help guide the investigation for a better understanding of what actually happened. This would be especially important if there was a witness statement that was made which conflicted with other statements that were obtained. The fact that has still not been contacted and a statement has still not been obtained from him is concerning. My word. It was practicable for officers to at least attempt to call the original reporting party, and despite Gabby's response to part of their statement, and despite the statements made from Gabby, Brian, and that person, it's impossible to state or know whether or not anything would have changed the outcome of this investigation through speaking with that person. As far as the documentation of the statements made, both Officer Pratt and Officer Robbins completed reports documenting their interactions regarding this case. They also both discussed the information they obtained independently from those involved when trying to decide what actions to take. Okay. Written report, Officer Pratt. Officer Pratt played an integral role in this investigation, yet Officer Pratt's written report doesn't reflect that. Officer Pratt spent a significant amount of time with Gabby, and he also had a phone conversation with one witness. Officer Pratt's time with Brian was much more minimal, and very little of his conversations with Brian was regarding Brian's statement of what happened. In Officer Pratt's report, he states that he had spoken with Brian, Gabby, and stated they all three gave similar and consistent stories. Officer Pratt then describes the incident in very little detail about what he understood what happened based on all three stories. Although I would agree their stories were similar, when it comes to documenting an incident and the statements from those involved, it's important to differentiate who said what so it's clear what was similar and consistent and what wasn't. This should include the who, what, when, where, how, and why, as that information could play a role in determining the predominant aggressor. There was also no documentation describing the injuries Officer Pratt observed, specifically on Gabby. There are statements made in Officer Pratt's report that require further follow-up. Officer Pratt states, "It wasn't clear, but I believe it was reported the male had been observed to have assaulted the female. This thought presumably came from the 911 caller and was reported through dispatch notes as well as to responding officers through dispatch radio." Officer Pratt additionally documents in his report that Brian grabbed Gabby's face and pushed her back. After Officer Pratt documents both incidents, 911 caller stating male was assaulting female and Brian grabbing Gabby's face and pushed her, it's then documented in his report, no one reported that the male struck the female. Oh dear. Applicable interview responses, Officer Pratt. I asked Officer Pratt what wasn't clear when he documented in his report that it wasn't clear, but I believe it was reported the male had been observed to have assaulted the female. Officer Pratt said, I wrote this report after the incident was completed, and by the time the incident was completed, I knew I had one person saying the opposite of another person, and those are my two independent witnesses, so to me, that's why I would have written it wasn't clear. I clarified with Officer Pratt that the statements made were clear, but what actually happened wasn't. Officer Pratt said again, when his report was written, it still wasn't clear to me because I had two witnesses saying opposite things, so therefore, I don't think it could be clear to the reader. I asked Officer Pratt how he came to the conclusion in his report that nobody reported Brian struck Gabby. Officer Pratt said he spoke to Brian, Gabby, and the witness, none of who reported this. Officer Pratt said by the time he was able to write his report, he recalled that he had 3 people all stating the opposite. Oh boy. Officer Pratt said in order for him to get access to the dispatch audio from the original caller, that information had to be formally requested and would take time. Yes, but in November they still didn't have it, huh? Apparently, allegedly, that's what they just said earlier. Officer Pratt said when he was writing his report, he was questioning himself on if he had even heard the original report from dispatch correctly due to the 3 statements he had being contradictory to what he remembered hearing from dispatch. It wasn't contradictory, though, because Gabby said, yeah, but I hit him first. So the yeah means, yes, this scratch on my face is from Brian, but I hit him first. So she justified why she's been scratched up. But that means there was at some point, of course, he hit her because she had marks on her face. Secondly, they didn't ask Brian, so did you hit her? They didn't ask him that. Hence, you know what I'm saying. Oh, my word. It's not 3 contradictory statements because Brian didn't get to answer if he hit her or not. Why does she have a mark on her face, huh? You know? I asked Officer Pratt again about the statement in his report about nobody reporting Brian had hit Gabby, despite the statement from Gabby that Brian had grabbed her face and caused a scratch. I asked Officer Pratt if he didn't consider someone grabbing a face a strike or a hit. Officer Pratt said he didn't consider a grab to be either of those. Oh no. Officer Pratt gave examples of a hit being a hit, a slap being a slap, etc. Officer Pratt explained that he believed it was important when we interview people to figure out what kind of contact was made and explain that contact. Officer Pratt said, maybe we could have done better at this. It's eyebrow time. Yes. Oh my word. It's just difficult to read this like this because I don't know. It was unclear to me, but they said the call that we even heard was the gentleman is slapping the girl. So if he's slapping the girl, how does she end up with a big scratch that burns on her face? That's friggin' slapping and scratching. Oh my word. Right. Officer Pratt said that although he doesn't consider a grab of the face a strike, he stated it could be an assault. Officer Pratt said it's important to describe the contact and the circumstances surrounding the contact. I told Officer Pratt that Gabby said Brian hit her and described it through demonstration face grabbing. Officer Pratt said he never recalls Gabby stating or acknowledging Brian hitting her, other than grabbing her face. Officer Pratt said he only recalls Gabby replying, well, I definitely hit him first. This is accurate, but after this response, Officer Pratt asked if Brian hit her, and Gabby replies, I guess, but I hit him first. When Gabby describes the violence against her, the only thing she ever describes is her face being grabbed. Regardless of whether or not there is confusion on what is being called a strike or a hit, Officer Pratt acknowledges that Brian caused injury to Gabby by grabbing her face, and Gabby interpreted being hit as having her face grabbed, at least according to her response. I asked Officer Pratt why there wasn't any follow-up with Brian regarding the statement Gabby made of Brian grabbing her face and causing injury. Officer Pratt said he thought it had been taken care of. Officer Pratt said Officer Robbins heard this information and Officer Robbins had spent the majority of his time with Brian while Officer Pratt spent the majority of his time with Gabby. Officer Pratt said, I shouldn't make these assumptions, but I assumed that he addressed it and it was corroborated and should have talked to Brian more about that. Well, you can't smell that the other officer would know that. I mean, he was talking to Gabby. Gabby said he grabbed my face. Gabby was telling him that, yeah, kind of, he hit me, but I hit him first, So he needs to relay that information to the other officers so that they can then ask Brian, well, why does she have this mark on her face? Why did you grab her face? Because that's definitely contradictory to what Brian said. Remember when Brian said, yeah, I was just like pushing her away just to like get away from me. But Gabby says you grabbed her face, which is what caused that deep scratch on her face. So then ask Brian, why did you grab her face? Because that's different to what he told them. Officer Pratt acknowledged the amount of time they had on the side of the road investigating this incident and said, some of these calls require more than that, and this was one of those calls where I wish we had more time. I wish I hadn't been called away. I wish I didn't feel like I had to rush at all. Rush? Damn. 75 minutes. Officer Pratt also said, if I didn't talk to Brian about that, or it wasn't followed up with Brian, that should have happened, for sure. I guess I assumed it had. I didn't know it hadn't. Officer Pratt explained that at this time, the only on-duty patrol officers were him and Officer Robbins. Officer Pratt stated Officer Robbins was still in field training, and Officer Pratt is required to be on every call that Officer Robbins is on. Oh no. Shovel, anyone? According to a survey in 2019, the population of Moab was just over 5,000 people, while tourism saw over 3 million visitors. It is believed that tourism has surpassed that number the last couple of years due to the... Now that's a trigger word for YouTube. If you think the DV is one, there's one. Due to the panoramic. Officer Pratt said, so how much time do you spend on a call? You know I work 10 hours. I gave 1/10 of my day to one couple and I have many other calls. The other calls that are going on, a guy laying in traffic, that it's important to him that I come drag him out of traffic. All these calls are important. If I had my way, I'd spend as much time as I needed on every call to make sure every call worked out right. But we don't have the staff. I'm not blaming the department, but we don't have the staff. Okay. I asked Officer Pratt why he didn't call the reporting party. Officer Pratt said calling them would have been the next thing he did, or would have had Officer Robbins call him, had he not been called away for a more urgent call. Officer Pratt stated at this time they'd spoken to Brian, Gabby, and the witness regarding this incident. Officer Pratt stated that his observations, as well as the statements made along with the physical evidence, everything was lining up. Officer Pratt said multiple times that the witness should have been called. That's the other witness. Officer Pratt said that if he had been called and repeated the same things he told dispatch, the 3 other statements, along with physical evidence, was still much stronger than that person's statement. Whoa. Okay. Officer Pratt described his line of questioning when talking with Gabby. Officer Pratt said he told Gabby, we have 2 independent witnesses. I said this because I thought my witness would line up with what I thought this guy told us. I thought we were going to have 2. And her response was, well, I definitely hit him first. At the end of everything, her statement was like Brian's and was like my witness's. Officer Pratt said multiple times during this call that there were 2 independent witnesses. Officer Pratt said this on multiple occasions and in front of Officer Robbins. Officer Pratt said he told Officer Robbins to get the reporting party statement referring to. Officer Pratt said later on, when reviewing Officer Robbins' report, he didn't find a statement from that person. Officer Pratt asked Officer Robbins where the reporting party statement was. Officer Robbins told him it was part of the report. It was then that Officer Pratt learned that Officer Robbins thought the reporting party was and not. Oh no. When talking about not following up with, Officer Pratt said, there's no way I can tell you this investigation should have had an end of report at the end of it without having talked to the guy who called. There's not an excuse for it. I can explain it. I can't excuse it. Officer Pratt also said, I can't imagine what he could have said, especially if it was what he told dispatch, that could have changed the decision that was made. Now, maybe if we didn't have that other independent witness, sure. Written report, Officer Robbins. In Officer Robbins' report, there are similar concerns. Officer Robbins spent the majority of his time speaking with Brian, but also got statements from Gabby regarding this incident. Officer Robbins was the reporting officer, and ultimately the decision on how this case concluded was made by him. The guy in field training was going to make the decision? Oh my word. There are more details listed in Officer Robbins' report than Officer Pratt's. However, there are many details missing from the statements he received from those he had contact with. Yes, in that case, maybe less is more, because they're like, there's more details, but there's also missing details. Oh man. There are also additional statements made in Officer Robbins' report that are a cause for concern. In Officer Robbins' report, while describing the statement made to him from Brian, Officer Robbins states Brian indicated Gabby went into a manic state. After watching the body-worn camera multiple times, I am unable to hear the statement actually made. It seems to me that Officer Robbins draws that conclusion himself and states that is what Brian said. Oh, no. Officer Robbins describes seeing minor visible scratches to Brian's face but doesn't indicate where these are at. Officer Robbins states he observed scratches on Brian's right arm but again doesn't indicate where on the arm the injuries are at. Officer Robbins states Brian believed the injuries on his right arm occurred when Gabby was trying to get his attention about Officer Robbins being behind them with his lights on. Officer Robbins then makes the following statement. This, however, was not consistent with Gabrielle's statement, further suggesting her confused and emotional state. Gabby's statement to Officer Robbins, which he documented in his report, was that she hit Brian in the arm to alert him to the police car behind them with their lights on. Brian also said that he believed that is where the marks came from. It was Gabby hitting him when she was trying to get his attention. Yes, because police lights, Brian, they don't get your attention. You're just going to drive at 3 times the speed, literally speeding away from police officers. And Gabby was hitting him at that point, I believe, in his arm, possibly tugging at the wheel a little bit to make him stop. You're going to have a car chase with police for what? What you running away from there? Huh? Man, I wish they searched the car. Who knows what they would have found. Oh my word. Brian also said that he believed this is where the marks came from. Yes, this adds confusion as to what Officer Robbins documented, as the information is actually consistent with Gabby's statement, which doesn't validate the conclusion made by Officer Robbins about Gabby's confused and emotional state. As with Officer Pratt's report, Officer Robbins' report should include the who, what, when, where, how, and why, as that information could play a role in determining the predominant aggressor. There are many details not documented in his report, as well as details documented that appear to be speculation or just flat out inaccurate. Applicable interview responses, Officer Robbins. There were multiple questions I had for Officer Robbins regarding his written report and the statements he reported to have been made. When I asked Officer Robbins if he had reviewed his body-worn camera footage of this incident prior to writing his report, he stated he thought he had, but wasn't positive. Officer Robbins confirmed he has access to the video, but did not have access to the dispatch notes and audio. When I asked Officer Robbins how many witnesses there were in this incident and whether or not he had talked to any of them, he stated there had been 2. Officer Robbins stated he made contact with and retrieved a written statement from him. Officer Robbins stated he had thought that was the person who had called 911, but later found out that was not accurate. Officer Robbins stated he hadn't reached out to for his statement at any time during or following this incident. In Officer Robbins' report, he stated that saw Brian and Gabby arguing over a phone. I asked Officer Robbins if he investigated this further by asking Brian or Gabby about it. Officer Robbins said he did not. In Officer Robbins' report, he stated that observed Gabby climbing into the van via the driver's side window. I asked Officer Robbins when, where, and to who this information was stated. Officer Robbins stated this person told him on the day he collected the written statement. I asked this information because during the phone call with Officer Pratt, as well as their written statement, it appears that Gabby climbed into the van via the driver's side door and over Brian's lap. There was never any mention about it being through the window. I asked Officer Robbins if his body-worn camera was activated while collecting this information from. Officer Robbins stated he wasn't sure if it was or wasn't. I found since there is no body camera recording of this contact. In Officer Robbins' report, he stated was not entirely sure what it is he had seen. I asked Officer Robbins what this was referring to, as he gave a prior statement to Officer Pratt on the phone and also provided a written statement which provided numerous details of what he had observed. Officer Robbins stated that this person was concerned about the incident possibly being involved in human trafficking. Wow, this guy takes quite the leaps, huh? She's emotional, just confused, emotional, and now we escalate to human trafficking? What? I asked Officer Robbins if what this person said was not sure about was what he actually saw, or if he was not sure about the circumstances causing the incident. Officer Robbins stated that this person was confident in what he actually saw, but wasn't sure of what the bigger picture or reasoning might be behind what he saw. Okay. In Officer Robbins' report, he described Brian's statement of what happened. Officer Robbins said that while Gabby and Brian were arguing near Main Street, Brian had attempted to separate from Gabby so they could both calm their emotions. Officer Robbins stated he got into their van. No, he got into Gabby's van, okay. And Gabrielle had gone into a manic state. Wow. Brian said Gabrielle, thinking he was going to leave her in Moab without a ride, went to slap him. As Gabrielle started to swing, Brian pushed her away to avoid the slap. As a result, Gabrielle off balance, but still caught Brian's face with some fingers, causing some minor visible scratches. Okay then. I asked Officer Robbins if stating Gabby went into a manic state was something that Brian actually said, or if it was something Officer Robbins concluded. Officer Robbins said, I haven't sat down and watched my body cam. I don't remember. I was also still on FTO and not very good at writing reports. So I'm probably guilty of possibly putting speculation in there. Yeah, probably. I then brought up the series of events that Officer Robbins documented above into how the physical fight started. I read it back to Officer Robbins and asked, do you recall what the actual information was that was provided to you by Brian? Officer Robbins said, no. I told Officer Robbins that after watching the video multiple times, I was unable to find anywhere that Brian said Gabby was being manic. I also was unable to find anywhere that Gabby or Brian described Gabby was scared Brian was going to leave her in Moab. Yeah, it was actually the other way around, huh? I told Officer Robbins that Brian said he was worried that Gabby was going to leave him in Moab, but not the other way around. Officer Robbins replied, I might have mixed those up. Oh, my word. I reminded Officer Robbins of the series of events that he described being how the physical fight started. I told Officer Robbins I was unable to verify that the information he put down is what was actually said. Officer Robbins replied, I was trying to piece it together because their stories were all over the place, as I'm sure you saw. They weren't exactly, this event happened, this event happened, this event happened, this event happened, and was this event happened, and then 20 minutes later, this even happened, and then 3 days ago, this event happened. So I was trying to piece everything together. Okay. In Officer Robbins' report, he said, I observed some small scratches to Brian's right arm, and when I asked him about them, he supposed they must have happened when Gabrielle was trying to get his attention about me being behind them with my lights on. This, however, was not consistent with Gabrielle's statement, further suggesting her confused and emotional state. Oh my word. I asked Officer Robbins what exactly was not consistent with Gabrielle's statement. Officer Robbins said, if I remember correctly, Brian said that she grabbed his arm, or said that he grabbed his arm. What? Or she said that he grabbed his arm. Okay, that sentence makes no sense. Anyways, the conflicting stories where one said he was being hit in the shoulder and the other one said that his arm was grabbed and that's what caused him to swerve and hit the curb. Something along the lines of that at least. Whoa, dude. More training. I told Officer Robbins that in his report, he stated Gabby told him that she hit Brian in the arm, and Brian's statement was that Gabby pulled on the steering wheel. When Officer Robbins asked Brian about the scratches, Brian said they must have happened when Gabby was trying to get his attention about the cops behind them. I told Officer Robbins that the inconsistency is with Brian's story and not Gabby's. Officer Robbins did not have a response. Yes. I asked Officer Robbins what else he recalled Gabby being confused about. Officer Robbins said, it didn't seem that she understood why we were there or the way that things could appear from the outside. She was obviously very emotional. Oh man, I'm just getting angry now. I have to say it. It's almost like, if all the ladies in the house going to understand, if you're angry because your man or a man did something, and this could happen with any relationship, I'm just making an example out of my own experience, and then you're angry and you're addressing something, and then they say, are you on your period? It feels like that when it's just like, well, she was obviously very emotional. My word. It just feels like that. It makes me angry when I see that. I asked Officer Robbins if he ever noticed any injuries to Gabby during his interactions with her. Officer Robbins stated he recalled there being a small scratch on one of her cheeks. I asked Officer Robbins if he asked Gabby how she received the injury, and Officer Robbins couldn't recall. I asked Officer Robbins if he asked Brian about the scratch on Gabby's cheek. Officer Robbins said he couldn't recall. Officer Robbins said he remembered there being something about Brian grabbing Gabby's face and pushing her back, but he couldn't recall where he got that information. From the information I've reviewed, nobody asked Brian about the scratch on Gabby's cheek. Exactly. There were a considerate number of details lacking from both officers' reports as it related to the statements made by all those involved. This person called 911 to report this incident, and his information as well as his statement was not obtained or documented in either of these reports. There's no information in either report to document any injury that was sustained by Gabby, despite her disclosing the injury. There was also very little detail. Okay, wait, she didn't even have to disclose it. It was right there on her face. My word. Anyway, but yes, there was also very little detail regarding the injury sustained by Brian. Also, no one asked him when he said, yeah, this is from a wire. What wire? When wire? Why? Why a wire? What is that? Remember the injury on his hand? Anyway, there were numerous injuries pointed out on Brian during the interaction, with very little of those injuries actually documented in the report. There are also numerous conclusions drawn or documented by Officer Robbins that don't actually appear to be accurate. Both written reports are missing significant details as it relates to the who, what, when, where, and how, as it relates to this incident. C. Officers should list the full name and date of birth and school, if available, of each child who was present in the household at the time of the offense. The names of other children who may not have been in the house at that particular time should also be obtained for follow-up. Unfounded. This section does not apply as it pertains to this investigation. Yes, of course. D. When practicable and legally permitted, video and audio record all significant statements and observations. Not sustained. Officer Robbins' body-worn camera was activated for the entirety of his contact with Gabby and Brian. I have learned that they do not have dash cameras on their vehicles, which also means they don't have in-car video or audio. Officer, what does he mean? I have learned, okay. Right, okay. Okay, interesting. One would think they know what they have and do not have. But okay, I have learned that they do not have dash cameras on their vehicles. Okay. Officer Pratt's body-worn camera is activated from the time he arrives on scene with Brian and Gabby until he leaves for another call. The only videos that may be of importance that I have not received, which would be if there is video of when Officer Pratt first arrives at the Moonflower Co-op. Yes, where's that? Where he first meets this witness. The other video would be when Officer Robbins follows up with that person later on and collects a written statement from him. Okay, yes, why is that not recorded? That's so dodgy, oh my word. Officer Pratt received a recorded verbal statement from this person, and Officer Robbins later recovers a written statement from them. I'm unsure if all significant statements were documented, because there may have been additional information stated verbally through these contacts that was additional or different than what was already documented. After meeting with Officer Pratt, Officer Robbins, and Assistant Chief Palmer, it has been determined that there are no videos of these two additional meetings, as they did not activate any recording devices during these contacts. Why? Because on the lack of information provided in the reports or the inaccurate statements made in the reports, it's impossible to know if there were any significant statements or observations that would have needed to be documented and or recorded. Well, that's sad. All injuries should be photographed, regardless of severity, taking care to preserve the victim's personal privacy. When practicable, photographs should be taken by a person of the same sex. That's what I was saying, the park ranger maybe for Gabby. Victims whose injuries are not visible at the time of the incident should be asked to contact the investigations in the event that the injuries later become visible. Sustained. While reviewing the body-worn camera of this incident, I determined photographs were taken of Brian's injuries by Officer Robbins, while no photographs were taken of Gabby's injuries. There were multiple injuries observed on both Brian and Gabby. Officer Robbins took into account Brian's personal privacy when asking him to lift up his shirt by having him move behind the van as to hide the view from passing motorists. Had there been pictures taken of Gabby, there was a female officer on scene to take those photographs if found to be necessary to preserve her privacy. On Gabby, there was a mark pointed out on her left arm, as well as a scratch on her left cheek. On Brian, injuries were pointed out by Park Ranger Ryan Kroll near his right eye, left side of his neck, left side of his nose, center of his face, bruised and bleeding on the right side of his head, and a red mark near his right bicep or tricep area. Officer Robbins photographed Brian's hands, left side of his head, face and neck, and right arm. Officer Robbins asked Brian to lift his shirt up, and I believe I could see a long red scratch or scar underneath his left pectoral, but no photographs taken. Okay, I gotta go look again at that. When asked during an interview, Officer Robbins stated he did not observe this mark, and if he had, he would have addressed it. When receiving all the requested documents for this investigation, I requested the photographs, but have not received any. Oh my word. In a subsequent interview with Officer Robbins, I reminded Officer Robbins of the numerous photographs he had taken during this incident. I pointed out that the injuries on Brian were the only ones photographed and no photographs of Gabby's injuries were taken. I also said there were photographs taken of both their driver's licenses. I asked Officer Robbins why there was no photographs taken of Gabby's injuries. Officer Robbins stated that Officer Pratt spent the most time with Gabby, and he made an assumption that Officer Pratt would have taken those photos. I asked Officer Robbins why the photographs weren't uploaded to the report. Officer Robbins said that one to this day I still don't know. Okay, is it just me, or is there like a bit of a red flag here with this Officer Robbins? I made a video before just analyzing. This is just random. Okay, his tattoos on his hand, I believe that was Officer Robbins, am I correct? Just talking about that a little bit, what it could mean, or what. But anyway, I'm just like, man, reading all this, I'm like, when he says that one to this day, I still don't know. Okay, so here we go, more. Officer Robbins went on to say that he believes he did upload the photographs, but they were not there when he checked. Oh my word. Officer Robbins stated the photographs are no longer on the phone he used to take the photographs, and stated he used his police department issued phone to take the photographs. Man, that's just sounding like friggin' dodgy to me. I don't know. I'm just like, bing, what? The way the policy reads, I interpret it as all injuries on the victim should be photographed. I would recommend that the policy be clarified to state that all injuries of all involved parties should be photographed. I asked Assistant Chief Palmer if he ever saw these photographs, and he stated he did not. I asked Officer Pratt if he ever saw the photographs, and he also said he did not. Officer Pratt provided an example of when the same thing happened to him on a different case around the time of this incident. Okay. Officer Pratt stated they use software from Taser. Oh, now we're going to blame software. Okay, that is installed on the department-issued cell phones. The software allows you to take the photo and photographs and upload them into the software where they can access it later on to attach to their reports. Officer Pratt said he had recorded a video using his phone off video surveillance that showed a hit-and-run incident. Officer Pratt said there's proof he recorded the video from his body-worn camera, and then there's proof of him pulling it up later to show someone involved in the case, and the video was gone. Officer Pratt said he hasn't had any issues with it since and doesn't know if something similar happened to Officer Robbins, but acknowledged that losing photographic or video evidence in this way has happened before. F. Officers should arrest the victim. Officers should request that the victim complete and sign an authorization for release of medical records related to the incident when applicable. Unfounded. This section does not apply as it pertains to this investigation. G. If the suspect is no longer at the scene, the officer should make reasonable efforts to locate the suspect. To further the investigation, provide the suspect with an opportunity to make a statement and make an arrest or seek an arrest warrant if appropriate. Unfounded, of course. Seize any firearms or any other dangerous weapons in the home. Yes, if appropriate and legally permitted for safekeeping as evidence. This applies to both investigations involving DV or dating violence. Utah Code, right? Unfounded. This section does not apply as it pertains to this investigation. I think it does. If you search that car, which was their home, you may have found a gun. When completing an incident or arrest report for violation of a court order, officers should include specific information that establishes that the offender has been served, including the date the offender was served, the name of the agency that served the order, and the provision of the order that the subject is alleged to having violated. When reasonably available, the arresting officer should attach a copy of the order to the incident or arrest report. Unfounded. This section does not apply as it pertains to this investigation. However, I will address some of the issues as it pertains to protective orders and how it could have applied to this case under the section 3116 dispatch assistance further on in the report. J. Officers should take appropriate enforcement action when there is probable cause to believe an offense has occurred. Factors that should not be used as sole justification for declining to take enforcement action include 1. Whether the suspect lives on the premises with the victim. 2. Claims, they say unfounded, claims by the suspect that the victim provoked or perpetuated violence. 3. The potential financial or child custody consequences of arrest. 4. The physical or emotional state of either party. 5. Use of drugs or alcohol by either party. 6. Denial that the abuse occurred where evidence indicates otherwise. 7. A request by the victim not to arrest the suspect. 8. Location of the incident, public or private. 9. Speculation that the complainant may not follow through with the prosecution. 10. Actual or perceived characteristics such as race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, economic status, age, cultural group, disability, or marital status of the victim or suspect. And 11. The social status, community status, or professional position of the victim or suspect. Unfounded. As already documented, I believe there was probable cause, an assault occurred between two cohabitants, which makes this incident a DV offense, and enforcement action should have taken place. After reviewing all the provided information, the following numbered sections that correlate with the numbered items above were observed, discussed, and or documented during the investigation. 1. There is conversation about the difficulty of separating Brian and Gabby because they've been living in the van for several months and they don't have any friends or family in the area. Could they not call either of their parents to help out? 2. Gabby said Brian kept telling her to shut up. Gabby also said, I was trying to get him to stop telling me to calm down. Okay, so it goes 1, 2, 4. So they're obviously going to this physical, emotional. Okay, 4. When it comes to Brian and Gabby's physical state, they both appeared to be healthy and fit with no obvious physical ailments. As it relates to mental state, Brian was very much in control of his emotions. Brian was calm and deliberate throughout this investigation and even joked around at times with the officers. Gabby was the complete opposite. At times, Gabby struggled to speak and her emotions were consistently escalated. Gabby's emotions caused her at times to have to stop and catch her breath. Gabby was sobbing while begging and pleading with Officer Pratt to not separate her and Brian. 7. When discussing the options of taking Gabby to jail or separating them, Brian asked, "Can I go to jail?" When he's told no, Brian asks why. Brian is told they don't have a charge for him. Brian then jokes by asking, what if he took Officer Robbins' radio? Brian states multiple times that he didn't want to pursue anything against Gabby and wanted to get rid of this, referring to the impending charge. 9. Based on the interviews and investigation, there was never speculation that Brian may not follow through with the prosecution, as Brian made it clear he didn't want anything done. Oh yeah, my speculation would be if there was a prosecution, he would for sure not have wanted to follow through, right? Speculation. Officer Pratt talked about the court process with Brian stating officers had to follow the law, but said that the prosecutor could still potentially dismiss the case. 10. The individual characteristics of Brian and Gabby were also talked about multiple times during this investigation. It is explained multiple times by Officer Pratt that just because Brian was bigger and stronger than Gabby, he could still be the victim of DV assault. Officer Pratt stated in his report that Brian was older, taller, and much heavier than Gabby. On scene, Officer Pratt refers to Gabby as a tiny, little, 105-pound soaking wet, and numerous other statements regarding Gabby not actually being a threat or danger to Brian based on their physical characteristics. Do we spot some errors or not? Because earlier they said, no, Brian said that. We have to rewatch that. Because here they say, on scene, Officer Pratt refers to Gabby as a tiny, little, 105-pound soaking wet. But remember earlier, when we read yesterday part 1, they said, no man, the police didn't say that. Brian said that. Okay. So Officer Pratt did say that. Based on all the information received in this case, I don't believe that any individual reason above was used as sole justification for not taking law enforcement action. There were multiple factors regarding this investigation discussed, but none of the reasons listed above were clearly used as sole justification reasons. I believe a combination of all the factors above, especially Gabby's emotional state, caused Officer Pratt to second guess himself and call a supervisor. According to body-worn camera video, I believe the sole reason that enforcement action didn't take place was due to the officers not reading the entire assault code, as well as their misinterpretation of the assault code. My word. 31141. Okay. 3114.1. If suspect is arrested, unfounded, the section does not apply based on the actions of the officers. If no arrest is made, the officer should advise the parties of any options, including but not limited to voluntary separation of the parties and appropriate resource referrals. There we go. Counselors, friends, relatives, shelter homes, victim witness unit, not sustained. What? Document the resolution in a report, unfounded. I don't know how that one can be not sustained, but okay, here we go. Well, we'll see now. So one is voluntary separation of the parties. Why is there no answer there? Maybe it's a collective answer. 1 and 2. A is not sustained. Okay, and B is unfounded. The officers facilitated a separation of Brian and Gabby, yes, while ensuring they each had shelter for the day and night if needed. Whether or not the separation of the parties was voluntary is unclear. Yeah. Officer Robbins tells Brian that although he asked that they give each other the night apart and take advantage of the time apart to decompress and gather their emotions, that he is not legally required to hold them to it. Officer Robbins tells Gabby that unless there is earth-shattering emergency news, to not contact Brian, as he wanted them to have time to relax, breathe, and contact their families. Brian was set up with a room using the help of a local resource to help victims of DV. Outside of setting Brian up with a room and suggesting they contact their families, I did not see there was any other resource referrals provided to Brian or Gabby. The officers documented this incident and resolution in a report. In a subsequent interview with Officer Robbins, I asked him to explain the legal authority he had to separate someone if he didn't believe a DV assault had taken place. Officer Robbins went on to explain that he was going to arrest Gabby for DV assault before concluding that the incident didn't meet all the elements of assault. Officer Robbins then decided to just separate them so they could cool off. Officer Robbins stated he was trying to create that environment for both of them. I asked Officer Robbins again what legal authority he had to separate someone if he didn't believe a DV assault had occurred. Officer Robbins said, I can't answer that because I don't know. Oh my word. In a subsequent interview with Officer Pratt, I asked him how Officer Robbins can lawfully require a separation to take place in lieu of making a case against Gabby for DV or domestic assault. Officer Pratt said, he can't. If you're not going to charge them, you can't. He required it. He didn't say by law. They didn't ask. As far as I know, you can't require someone to separate. He feels like if they gave an indication, they weren't going to follow that advice. Then Officer Robbins would have made the other case for the safety of both of them. Oh man, what a mess. Okay, victim assistance. 3115. Because victims may be traumatized or confused, officers should be aware that a victim's behavior and actions may be affected. The following applies to DV and dating violence. Utah Code 77362.1, Utah Code 78B 7408. A. Victims shall be provided with the Department's Domestic Violence Information handout, even if the incident may not rise to the level of a crime. Sustained. Victims shall also be alerted to any available victim advocate shelters and community resources. Sustained. When an involved person requests law enforcement assistance while removing essential items of personal property, the officer shall stand by for a reasonable amount of time. Unfounded. If the victim has sustained injury or complains of pain, the officer shall seek medical assistance for the victim as soon as practicable. Unfounded. E. Officer should ask the victim whether he or she has a safe place to stay and assist in arranging transportation to an alternate shelter if the victim expresses a concern for his or her safety, or if the officer determines that a need exists. Unfounded. F. Officer should make reasonable efforts to ensure that any children or dependent adults who are under the supervision of the suspect or victim are being properly cared for. Unfounded. And G. If appropriate, officers shall seek or assist the victim in obtaining an emergency order. Unfounded. Sections F and G do not apply to this investigation. A. I did not find through body-worn camera or reports that Brian or Gabby received the Department's Domestic Violence Information handout. B. Brian was provided a place of shelter for the night utilizing a community resource they have for victims of DV. Outside of the shelter, I could not find that anyone was provided with any information regarding a victim advocate. C. Before separating Brian and Gabby, Brian asked if he could retrieve some items out of the van before they were separated. Park Ranger Ryan Krell assisted Brian in retrieving any relevant or necessary items he needed. D. Gabby and Brian both sustained injuries, and Gabby mentioned pain she was having from her injury. Brian was asked if he needed medical attention, and Brian declined the offer. The policy only states that this applies to the victim. At the time Gabby disclosed her injury, they had not concluded who was the predominant aggressor, who that was, and she was not asked if she needed medical attention. There was also no follow-up questions asked to Brian regarding the injury Gabby sustained. And E. After finding out that Brian and Gabby didn't have any friends or family in the area where one of them could stay, shelter was arranged for Brian, utilizing a local community resource for victims of DV, while Gabby was allowed to stay with the van they had been traveling and living in. Wow. 3116, dispatch assistance. All calls of DV, including incomplete 911 calls, should be dispatched as soon as practicable. Dispatchers are not required to verify the validity of a court order before responding to a request for assistance. Officers should request that dispatchers check whether any of the involved persons are subject to the terms of a court order. Not sustained. The incident was reported as a DV incident. Officer Robbins handled the investigation and obtained the identifying information from Brian and Gabby. It's common practice to run individuals through dispatch to check for wants, warrants, protective orders, and driver license information. Officer Robbins only asked dispatch for a 29 check by name and date of birth for Brian. A 29 check refers to the 10 code of 1029, which is checking for wants, warrants, protective orders, etc. Officer Robbins asked dispatch to run Brian out of Florida. Dispatch returns and states they are unable to find anyone with that name and date of birth out of Florida. I'm not sure if they also checked for a driver's license for Brian as well, or just checked the 29 status as requested by Officer Robbins. Okay. Officer Robbins asked dispatch for another 29 by name and date of birth, this time for Gabby. Officer Robbins misheard Gabby's last name and misspelt it. Officer Robbins read the incorrect letters back to Gabby, as she didn't correct Officer Robbins. The last name was relayed to dispatch as being Petito, rather than Petito. Officer Robbins asked dispatch to run Gabby out of Florida. Dispatch relays to Officer Robbins that the 29s are 1010 and states there was no 27 driver's license found. When 1010 is used, it means there are no listed wants, warrants, protective orders, etc. Because of the misspelled name, if there had been a protective order under her name, there's a chance they wouldn't have found it. Okay, but if they can't find driver's licenses for them, then isn't that a cause for concern? Because they're driving around in a van living the van life. I'm just saying, then check again. In a subsequent interview with Officer Robbins, I asked Officer Robbins why he didn't verify the information with Gabby after dispatch had told him they were unable to find any driver's license information based on the information Officer Robbins reported to them. Officer Robbins said he didn't know and said, the driving statuses weren't on my highest priority list. Okay, so for a couple living the van life, living literally out of the van for months, causing possibly the tension between them living in their little van for months. Well, the plan was a 4-month road trip, wasn't it? But you can't find their driver's licenses, but that wasn't on your priority list? Oh, my word. Officer Robbins also added that he may have missed that information as it was busy and it's difficult sometimes to catch everything that's going on in front of you, as well as what's being relayed in your ear by dispatch. Officer Robbins also stated the earpiece he had at the time was not functioning well, and the quality of the audio he was hearing was poor. I explained the importance of finding out driver license information, especially as it relates to people who are not local, so you can confirm they are who they say they are, as well as ensuring you're gathering and transmitting accurate information. Oh my word. Foreign court orders. Various types of orders may be issued in DV cases. Any foreign court order properly issued by a court of another state, Indian tribe, or territory shall be enforced by officers as if it were the order of a court in the state. An order should be considered properly issued when it reasonably appears that the issuing court has jurisdiction over the parties and reasonable notice and opportunity to respond was given to the party against whom the order was issued. An otherwise valid out-of-state court order shall be enforced, regardless of whether the order has been properly registered with the state. Unfounded. There were no protective orders found between Brian and Gabby. Yeah, because they didn't look up the right information, right? As documented above, there could have been one, and it may not have been found. However, with Brian's correct information relayed, it's likely if there had been a protective order between Brian and Gabby, it should or could have come up when checking Brian's information as well. 3118. Verification of court orders. Determining the validity of a court order, particularly an order from another jurisdiction, can be challenging. Therefore, in determining whether there is probable cause to make an arrest for a violation of any court order, officers should carefully review the actual order when available and where appropriate and practicable. Ask the subject of the order about his or her notice or receipt of the order, his or her knowledge of its terms and efforts to respond to the order. B. Check available records or databases that may show the status or conditions of the order. C. Contact the issuing court to verify the validity of the order. And D. Contact a law enforcement official from the jurisdiction where the order was issued to verify information. Officers should document in an appropriate report their efforts to verify the validity of an order, regardless of whether an arrest is made. Officers should contact a supervisor for clarification when needed. Unfounded. This doesn't apply in this case since no protective orders were located. Okay, 3119. Legal mandates and relevant laws. Utah law provides for the following. 31191. Standards for arrest. Officers responding to a DV call shall arrest or issue a citation to a domestic violence offender if there is probable cause to believe an offense has occurred. The offense need not occur in the officer's presence. Utah Code 77362.2. Any citation issued shall note that the offense involved in a DV offense, Utah Code 77720, and they say sustained. This has already been previously addressed and responded to in the report under Utah State Code. Yes, we know Gabby should have been cited. B. An officer shall arrest an alleged perpetrator whenever there is probable cause to believe that the alleged perpetrator has violated any of the provisions of a court order or condition of release agreement, and there is evidence the order has been served. The offense need not occur in the officer's presence. Utah Code 77362.4 and Utah Code 78B 7119, unfounded. This section does not apply as no court orders were located between the two parties. Okay. When it's all this writing and it says unfounded, just pause it if you want to read it. I'm just going to go through it a little bit, otherwise we'll be here for absolutely ever. All right, you can see it here, and it says unfounded. This has already been previously addressed and responded to in this report. I will, however, note each section above briefly. Section 1. This was not investigated or disclosed by either party. 2. No protective order was found. 3. This was not investigated or disclosed by either party. Same for 4. 5. Same. And 6, there was no evidence disclosed or observed that were clear signs that the victim would be subjected to continued violence or abuse. Page 37. This is also unfounded, right? Wait, let's just look at this quickly. In responding to a DV incident, officers should generally be reluctant to make dual arrests. If an officer receives complaints of DV from 2 or more opposing persons, the officer shall evaluate each complaint separately to identify the predominant physical aggressor. If the officer determines that one person was the predominant physical aggressor, the officer need not arrest the other person alleged to have committed DV. In determining the predominant aggressor, the officer shall consider any prior complaints of DV, the relative severity of injuries inflicted on each person, the likelihood of future injury to each of the parties, and 4, whether one of the parties acted in self-defense. Unfounded. This has already been addressed under the Utah State Code section. An officer may not threaten, suggest, or otherwise indicate the possible arrest of all parties in order to discourage any party's request for intervention by law enforcement. That's unfounded, already addressed. Remember that. F. When an alleged perpetrator is arrested or issued a citation and subsequently released by this department, the releasing officer shall then make a reasonable effort to notify the victim of that release and shall transmit that information to the statewide DV network. Utah Code, unfounded. This section does not apply as nobody was arrested either by citation or by custody. G. An officer who does not make an arrest shall notify the victim of his or her right to initiate a criminal proceeding and of the importance of preserving evidence. unfounded. This has already been addressed in the Utah State Code section. Okay, let's see. This one is also unfounded. This section does not apply, as no court orders were located, and none of the involved parties indicated there were any court orders. More things that don't apply, does not apply. This one, reports and records. Reports on all incidents of DV shall include Utah Code 7736 2.2, the officer's disposition on the case, the appropriate crime classification for DV. If no arrest was made, the report shall detail the grounds for not arresting. If two parties are arrested, the report shall detail the grounds for arresting both parties. Sustained. There was a case report completed regarding this case, and it has been identified as Moab Police Case 2021-001108. As it relates to Utah Code 7736 2.2, that has already been addressed previously in this report under Utah State Code. In the case report, the incident is categorized as a disorderly conduct incident and details the disposition of the case. The classification for this report should have been a DV-related category. The report details the grounds for not arresting, and due to there being no arrests, the report does not need to detail grounds for arresting both parties. I have detailed my concerns with the content of the case reports under the section above titled Investigations 3114, subsection B. Okay. Wow. So the officer creating the report should provide the victim with a case number of the report. The case number may be placed in the appropriate space on the victim information handout provided to the victim. If the case number is not immediately available, the officer should explain to the victim how he or she can obtain the information at a later time. This has already been previously addressed under Utah State Code section. Okay, so unfounded, already addressed. The records manager shall forward a copy of the incident report to the appropriate prosecuting attorney within 5 days after the complaint of DV occurred. Sustained, this has already been addressed. Yes, they should have done that. And then there's more unfounded things here. Wow. It is a very long report. We're on page 40. Let's just see. So we'll stop it here. Next, we'll look at Moab City Policy. Okay. Thank you for joining me for almost 2 hours reading through that section. We'll start on page 40 for part 3. There's 102 pages to work through. If you like me covering this in this way, I know it's long and I know we're busy with other cases and things, but if you want me to continue this, please give it a thumbs up and comment below, and I will just continue going through it. I mean, I'm going to continue either way, but if it's not something for you, if you guys are like, no, I don't want it, I'll just put it for the members only. But I'm going to continue from page 14 next in part 3. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Yes, and I'll see you in the next one.